Cold iron clicked. Cameron leveled the Winchester at the cabin door. Inside, a fire crackled bleeding warmth through the warped pine boards. But it was the smell that stopped him cold. Rich, heavy venison fat melting into wild onions and thyme. His thyme. Nobody had cooked a meal in that hearth for 5 years. He kicked the door open, finger tight on the trigger, expecting a thief. Instead, he found a woman holding a wooden spoon, shaking like a wet dog. Snow crunched under Cameron Tanner's snowshoes, a rhythm he had walked to for 8 winters. He carried a string of skinned hares over his left shoulder, the raw meat freezing solid in the sub-zero wind. The Wyoming timberline was an unforgiving stretch of jagged rock and dead pines, a place where men came to hide or die. Cameron had come to do a bit of both. He paused at the ridge overlooking his valley. His cabin sat in the basin below a squat structure of notched logs and mud chinking. It was supposed to be a dead-cold box waiting for his return. Instead, a thin white ribbon of smoke curled from the stone chimney. Cameron dropped the hares. He unslung his rifle, thumbing back the hammer. Drifters were common enough in the lower elevations, men pushed out by the law or bad debts. Up here they were rare. Usually, if you found a man in your cabin, it meant he was either stupid enough to think it was abandoned or desperate enough not to care. Either way, it usually ended with a shovel and frozen dirt. He took the descent slowly, keeping the timber between him and the cabin windows. The wind howled, masking his approach. He checked the perimeter. No horses, no tracks, leading away only a single set of boot prints, dragging heavily up from the South Pass, half buried by the morning drift. Small feet, but heavy steps. Exhaustion. He flattened his back against the rough bark of the cabin's exterior wall, inching toward the heavy oak door. That was when the scent hit him. It bypassed his caution and hit his stomach like a hammer. Venison. Roasted root vegetables. The sharp, earthy bite of dried thyme. He kept a jar of it on the high shelf above the hearth, hoarded from a summer foraging trip 2 years back. The smell was domestic warm and entirely alien to the brutal reality of his life. For a split second, a phantom memory of a life he'd buried tried to claw its way up his throat. He forced it down. Cameron stepped in front of the door, aimed the Winchester at center mass, and kicked the latch. The door slammed inward, banging against the log wall. "Don't move!" Cameron barked, stepping into the dim interior. The cabin was warm. Too warm. A massive fire roared in the stone fireplace, eating through his carefully stacked cordwood. Standing by the hearth was not a hardened outlaw, nor a desperate gold-pan drifter. It was a woman. She dropped a cast-iron lid with a loud, ringing clatter. She shrank back against the stone's hands, flying up eyes wide and fixed on the black bore of the rifle. She wore a wool coat 3 sizes too large, the hem caked in frozen mud and ice. A fraying men's scarf wrapped around her neck. Her face was gaunt, the skin pulled tight over her cheekbones, smeared with soot and ash. "Don't shoot," she croaked. Her voice was raw, like she had been swallowing sand. "Please." Cameron didn't lower the gun. His eyes swept the room. His pelts were untouched. His ammunition box remained latched. But the cast-iron pot hung over the fire, bubbling, sending up plumes of heavily spiced steam. "Who else is here?" Cameron demanded, his voice a low, gravelly scrape in the small room. "No one," she said, her chest heaving. "Just me." "You walked up the South Pass alone?" "Yes." "Lie to me again, and you can walk back down it with a hole in your leg." "I'm not lying." She stepped forward, then immediately froze as the rifle barrel twitched. "I swear to God, I'm alone. My horse died 2 days ago in the lower valley. I walked the rest. I saw the roof line from the ridge." Cameron stared at her. She was shivering, though the cabin was stifling. It was the deep, core-shaking tremble of someone who had pushed their body past its absolute limits and was running on adrenaline and borrowed time. He noted the way she stood, weight shifted off her left foot, favoring a badly wrapped boot held together with twine. He slowly lowered the rifle, keeping the hammer cocked. "You broke my lock," he said flatly. "I used a rock on the padlock." She admitted, her voice trembling, but gaining a fraction of stability. "I'm sorry. I was freezing. I was going to die out there. People die out there every day. Doesn't mean they get to break into my house." She didn't cry. Cameron expected tears, expected the usual hysterics he had seen in the settlements when women were faced with disaster. Instead, she just swallowed hard, her jaw tightening. She looked at him. Really looked at him. Taking in the grease in his hair, the scars on his chin, the animal skins he wore. She didn't flinch. "I'm sorry." She repeated the apology, sounding more pragmatic than genuinely remorseful. "I used your firewood and your dried meat." Cameron stepped fully into the room, kicking the door shut behind him. The sudden silence, save for the crackling fire, felt heavy. He leaned the Winchester against the wall near the door, though he kept his Colt revolver strapped to his hip. He walked over to the hearth. The woman scrambled backward, pressing herself into the corner, giving him a wide berth. Cameron looked down at the cast-iron pot. He took the wooden spoon resting on the stones and gave the thick liquid a stir. Chunks of dried venison, rehydrated and tenderized, floated alongside wild carrots and cracked barley. "Who made this?" Cameron asked, his voice deadpan. The woman stared at him, bewildered by the question. "I did." "You used my winter stores." "I was hungry. I hadn't eaten in 4 days." Cameron tapped the spoon against the rim of the pot. He didn't look at her. "There's a lot of things you can do when you're starving. Most people just eat the jerky cold. They don't take the time to build a stew. They don't go digging in a stranger's cupboards for thyme. If I was going to eat," she said, her voice dropping a register, finding a stubborn edge, "I was going to do it right. If you're going to shoot me for it, do it. But let me finish the bowl first." Cameron turned his head, locking eyes with her. Her eyes were a flat, flinty grey. There was fear there, yes, but beneath it was a bedrock of sheer, stubborn refusal to fold. He reached onto the shelf, grabbed a tin bowl, and ladled a heavy portion of the stew into it. He walked over to his small, rough-hewn table, sat down, and took a bite. The stew scalded his tongue, but Cameron didn't care. It was a revelation. For half a decade, his meals consisted of charred meat, hardtack, and whatever beans he could boil into submission. Food was fuel. It kept the cold out and the muscles working. This, however, was something else entirely. The venison was perfectly tender. The barley had thickened the broth to a rich gravy, and the thyme cut through the gamey taste of the meat with a sharp, clean finish. He ate in silence. The only sounds in the cabin were the scrape of his tin spoon against the bowl and the snap of the fire. The woman remained by the hearth, watching him with a mixture of apprehension and hungry desperation. She had barely taken a few bites before he had kicked the door in. Now she was caught in a strange purgatory, waiting to see if her host was going to kill her, throw her into the snow, or just finish her cooking. Cameron finished the bowl. He set the spoon down. He didn't wipe his mouth. "What's your name?" he asked. "Clarissa," she said. "Clarissa Higgins." "You a widow, Clarissa Higgins?" She hesitated. Her gaze dropped to the floorboards for a fraction of a second before snapping back up. "Yes. Your husband died recently. 6 months ago. Fever. And you decided to take a winter stroll up the mountain because the grief got too heavy." Cameron's tone was devoid of sympathy. It was analytical probing for holes in her story. Clarissa's jaw tightened. "I left because I was forced out." Cameron leaned back in his chair, wood creaking under his weight. "Nobody forces a widow out in the winter unless she owes money or she killed somebody. I didn't kill anyone." Clarissa snapped a flash of genuine anger breaking through her carefully controlled exterior. My husband left debts. The bank took the farm. The man who bought it. He wasn't interested in letting me stay on as a tenant. He made it clear that if I stayed in town, I'd be paying off Elias's debts in ways I wasn't willing to endure. Cameron knew the type. The frontier towns were crawling with opportunists who wore suits and hid behind ledger books, men who built empires on the backs of ruined families. So you just started walking? I was trying to reach the railhead at Oakhaven, she said. I got lost. The snow covered the trail. Then the horse broke its leg. Oakhaven is 40 miles east. You walked north. You're in the wrong mountain range, Clarissa. The fight seemed to drain out of her all at once. Her shoulders slumped, the oversized wool coat swallowing her frame. She looked away, staring into the flames. I know, she whispered. I realized it 2 days ago, but I couldn't turn back. I just kept walking toward the highest point, hoping to see a town. Then I saw your smoke. Cameron stood up. He walked back to the hearth, grabbed the ladle, and filled a second tin bowl. He turned and held it out to her. Clarissa looked at the bowl, then up at his face, searching for a trick. Eat, Cameron said. You're no good to me dead on my floor. She took the bowl with trembling hands. She didn't sit at the table. She slid down the stone wall of the fireplace, sitting on the hearth, pulling her knees to her chest. She ate quickly, mechanically, but with a fierce intensity. Cameron watched her for a moment before turning his back. He went to the door, retrieved his skinned hairs from the snowbank outside, and brought them in. He tossed them onto the heavy butcher block in the corner. He grabbed a skinning knife and began to process the meat. The bloody, brutal work grounded him. He needed the distraction. Having another human being in his space felt like a violation. He knew where every tool, every bullet, every ounce of flour was kept. He had designed his life to be a closed loop, relying on no one answering to no one. This woman was a variable. She was a complication. Complications in the mountains usually meant death. There's an extra blanket in the chest by the bed, Cameron said, without turning around his knife, sliding cleanly through sinew and bone. You can sleep on the rug by the fire tonight. Tomorrow you leave. Behind him, Clarissa stopped eating. Leave. You heard me. It's 20 degrees below freezing out there. The snow is knee-deep. I'll give you a pair of snowshoes and draw you a map to Oakhaven, Cameron said, throwing a piece of raw meat into a salt bucket. If you leave at first light, you might make it before the next front moves in. I'll die, Clarissa said. It wasn't a plea. It was a statement of fact. Cameron finally turned around, wiping the blade on a stained rag. Not my problem. You broke into my house. You ate my food. I'm giving you a full belly and a map. That makes me a saint in these parts. Don't push your luck. Clarissa stared at him. The firelight cast long, flickering shadows across her face, hollowing out her cheeks. She set the empty bowl on the stones beside her. She didn't argue. She didn't beg. She just nodded slowly, a dark, cynical acceptance settling over her features. All right, she said softly. She stood up, wincing as she put weight on her injured foot. She limped over to the wooden chest, pulled out the heavy wool blanket, and wrapped it around her shoulders. She lay down on the braided rug in front of the hearth, turning her back to him. Cameron watched her for a long time. He hated the way she hadn't argued. He hated the quiet resignation in her voice. It felt like an accusation. He turned back to his butchering, the scrape of his knife sounding entirely too loud in the quiet cabin. The morning light was a brutal, blinding white reflecting off the fresh snow outside the frost-choked windows. Cameron was awake before dawn. He always was. He lay in his cot for a moment, listening. Usually the morning brought only the sound of wind battering the logs. Today there was the rhythmic, quiet scrape of cast iron on stone. He swung his legs out of bed, grabbing his boots. Clarissa was already up. She had rebuilt the fire from the embers. She was knelt by the hearth, cleaning the pot with snow she had brought in from outside, scrubbing the iron with a handful of dried pine needles. Her movements were stiff, her face pale, but she worked with a practiced, methodical efficiency. Next to his boots, on the small wooden bench, sat his heavy canvas coat. Cameron stared at it. Yesterday it had a 6-inch tear near the left pocket, where a branch had snagged him a week ago. Today it was stitched shut. The thread was thick black twine, likely pulled from the bottom of his supply crate, but the stitches were tight, even, and incredibly strong. He looked from the coat to Clarissa. "I didn't ask you to do that." Cameron said, his voice rough with sleep. Clarissa didn't look up from her scrubbing. "I know, but I used your thread. Seemed fair to pay for the stew." Cameron pulled his boots on, lacing them tight. He stood up, grabbing the coat. He ran his thumb over the mended canvas. It was good work, better than he could have done. He pushed the thought away. "Map's on the table," he said, walking to the counter and wrapping a hunk of salted venison and 2 hardtack biscuits in an oiled cloth. He tossed the bundle onto the table next to a piece of charcoal-sketched parchment. "Snowshoes are by the door. Bindings are adjustable. Pull them tight or you'll lose them in a drift." Clarissa rinsed the pot, dried it with a rag, and hung it back on its hook. She stood up, brushing ash from her skirt. She looked at the food, then at the map. "Thank you," she said. She walked over to the door, sitting heavily on a crate to inspect the snowshoes. She began to unlace her ruined boots, intending to bind the webbing directly to her feet. Cameron watched her from the hearth, pouring himself a cup of black, boiling coffee. He told himself to look away. He told himself to let her walk out the door. She was an adult. She made her choices. The frontier didn't grade on a curve, and he wasn't running a charity. But as she pulled off her left boot, Cameron saw her foot. The wrapping of twine and rags was soaked through with dark, dried blood. As she peeled the fabric back, Cameron winced. Her heel was a mess of blistered, torn flesh, the skin rubbed raw, and beginning to show the dark, angry signs of frostbite and infection. Clarissa didn't make a sound. She bit her lower lip, her face draining of what little color it had left, and reached for the leather straps of the snowshoes. "You're not walking 40 miles on that," Cameron said. The words slipped out before he could stop them. Clarissa paused, her hands hovering over the straps. "I don't have a choice. You'll make it 5 miles before the infection puts you on the ground. You'll freeze to death before noon. Then I'll freeze." Clarissa said, her voice hard. She looked up at him, her grey eyes burning with a sudden desperate defiance. "You told me to leave. I'm leaving. What do you want from me?" "I want you to use your head," Cameron snapped, setting the coffee cup down with a sharp thud. "You can't walk on that foot." "So what's the alternative?" She shot back, standing up on one leg, leaning against the doorframe. "I stay here. You made it perfectly clear last night that I'm not welcome. If I go back down the mountain, Boyd Campbell's men will find me. They've been tracking me since I left town." Cameron frowned. "Boyd Campbell. He bought my husband's debt," Clarissa said, spitting the name like poison. "He runs the trading post in Red Creek. He owns half the valley. When Elias died, Boyd came to collect. Said the farm wasn't enough. Said I owed him interest. He told me I could work it off in his saloon, entertaining his freighters." Cameron knew Boyd Campbell. Red Creek was a 2-day ride south. Campbell was a bloated, ruthless tick of a man who made his fortune selling watered-down whiskey and overpriced mining claims. "I refused," Clarissa continued, her breathing shallow. "I locked my doors. 3 nights later, 2 of his men kicked them in. I slipped out the back window and ran. They chased me into the foothills. That's why I couldn't stay on the trail. That's why I'm here." She stared at him, exhausted, hollowed out. "I have nowhere left to go, mister. There is no town waiting for me. There is no family. If I walk out that door, I am dead. If I go back, I am worse than dead. So let me put these damn snowshoes on and take my chances with the ice." She reached down for the straps again. Cameron looked at the mended tear in his coat. He looked at the clean pot hanging over the fire. He looked at the sheer, terrifying resolve of a woman who had absolutely nothing left to lose. He swore under his breath. It was a vicious, ugly curse. He walked over to the door, grabbed the snowshoes out of her hands, and threw them into the corner of the room. They clattered loudly against the logs. Clarissa jumped, pressing herself against the door. "What are you doing?" "Take your coat off," Cameron said, walking past her to a wooden cabinet. He pulled out a clean rag, a bottle of harsh grain alcohol, and a tin of bear-fat salve. "What? Take the coat off. Sit down on the bed." Cameron turned around, glaring at her. "I'm not burying you in my front yard. The ground is too hard to dig." Clarissa stared at him, confused, defensive. "You said—" "I know what I said." Cameron walked over to the bed, setting the supplies down. He pointed a calloused finger at her. "Here's the deal. You stay, but you work, you cook, you mend what needs mending, you skin what I trap. You pull your weight or I throw you out myself." "Understood." Clarissa blinked, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she processed the sudden shift. Yes, I can do that. I know how to work." "Good." Cameron pointed at the bed again. "Sit down. Let me look at that foot." Clarissa limped over to the cot and sat on the edge. Cameron knelt on the floor in front of her. He poured a splash of alcohol onto the rag. "This is going to burn," he warned. "I've felt worse," she replied, gripping the edge of the mattress. Cameron pressed the rag to the torn flesh of her heel. Clarissa gasped, her whole body jerking, but she didn't pull away. Cameron worked quickly, cleaning the wound, applying the thick, foul-smelling salve, and wrapping it in a clean linen bandage. His hands were large and rough-scarred from years of knife slips and trap springs, but his movements were surprisingly gentle. "Keep weight off it for 3 days," Cameron said, tying off the bandage. He stood up, wiping his hands on his trousers. 3 days," Clarissa repeated, looking at the clean bandage. She looked up at him. "Why are you doing this?" Cameron picked up his coffee cup. He looked at the dark liquid, avoiding her gaze. "Because I like the way you make stew," he lied. "Now get the fire built up. I'm going out to check the snare lines." He grabbed his Winchester, threw his heavy coat over his shoulders, and walked out the door, leaving her alone in the warmth. Winter in the high country did not announce its passage with dates on a calendar. It was measured in cords of wood, burned pounds of flour consumed, and the slow, grinding retreat of the sun behind the western peaks. For the first 3 days, the cabin was thick with an uneasy, suffocating silence. Clarissa obeyed Cameron's orders with a rigid, desperate discipline. She stayed off her foot. She sat on the wooden crate by the hearth, her injured leg propped on a stump, and worked until her fingers bled. She took over the mending, sewing tight, heavy patches over the frayed knees of his canvas trousers. When he brought in a gutted badger, she didn't turn her head in disgust. She asked for his skinning knife. Cameron had handed it to her, expecting her to ruin the pelt. He watched from the corner of his eye as he oiled his rifle. Clarissa worked the blade with a steady, unsentimental precision. She separated hide from muscle, keeping the fat intact, her hands slick with blood. Farm hands. Hands that knew how to break a chicken's neck and butcher a hog before the first frost. He didn't praise her. He simply took the pelt when she was finished and stretched it over a drying board. They communicated in a sparse, functional shorthand. More wood. Water needs boiling. Knife is dull. They moved around each other like two stray dogs forced into the same alley, acutely aware of the other's teeth, giving a wide berth to avoid a fight. Cameron found it exhausting. He had spent 5 years honing his isolation into a weapon against his own memories. He knew the exact creak of the floorboards. He knew the draft that rattled the eastern window. Now there was a new rhythm in the dark. The soft rustle of wool blankets, the ragged catch of her breathing when the pain in her foot flared in the middle of the night. On the 4th evening, the storm finally broke. The wind died, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt heavy. Cameron sat at the small table, working a whetstone over his hatchet in slow, rhythmic circles. Clarissa was at the hearth, roasting a row of potatoes in the coals. She wore a clean, oversized flannel shirt he had thrown at her 2 days prior, her own ruined dress washed and hanging from a rafter. "Your limp is better." Cameron noted his voice scraping against the quiet. Clarissa looked up. She shifted her weight, testing the heel. The swelling went down. The salve worked. "I can stand on it today without seeing stars." "Good. Tomorrow you can fetch the water. The creek is frozen over, but there's a weak spot near the bend. Take the iron bar to break the ice." Clarissa nodded, turning the potatoes with an iron tong. "I noticed your snare wire is rusted out on the spare coils." She said, her tone completely devoid of accusation, stating a simple fact. "I soaked them in vinegar from the pantry and scrubbed them with sand. They'll hold a catch now without snapping." Cameron stopped the whetstone. He looked over at the workbench. The tangled, rusted mess of brass wire he had been meaning to fix for 3 months was neatly coiled, shining dully in the firelight. He looked back at Clarissa. She didn't meet his eyes entirely focused on pulling a charred potato from the ashes. She wasn't seeking his approval. She was paying her rent. She was making herself useful so he wouldn't throw her back into the snow. "I appreciate it," Cameron said. It was a small thing. 3 words. But in the cramped, airless space of the cabin, it landed with the weight of a dropped anvil. Clarissa's hand stilled for a fraction of a second. She didn't say anything, but the tight, defensive line of her shoulders dropped a single inch. Later that night, Cameron lay awake on his cot. The fire had burned down to a dull, pulsing orange glow. Clarissa was asleep on the rug, her back to him, wrapped in the heavy wool blankets. He stared at the ceiling beams. He had a system. He had rules. He survived because he didn't care about anything beyond the timberline. But as he listened to the slow, steady rhythm of her breathing, he realized the cabin didn't feel crowded anymore. It just felt warm. The thaw was a lie. The mountain offered a single day of brilliant, blinding sunshine before the barometric pressure dropped like a stone, bringing a sky the color of bruised iron. Clarissa stood knee-deep in the snowdrift beside the cabin, swinging the heavy iron bar down into the frozen surface of the creek. Ice splintered, flying up to sting her cheeks. She was breathing hard, the frigid air burning her lungs, but it felt good. Her heel ached a deep, bruised throb, but the skin was knitting together. She hauled up a bucket of freezing black water and turned back towards the cabin. Cameron emerged from the timberline 100 yards away. He was moving fast. Too fast. He didn't have the relaxed, rolling stride of a man returning from a routine trapline check. His shoulders were hunched, his rifle carried across his chest at the ready, not slung over his back. Clarissa stopped. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. You didn't survive a violent marriage and a flight across the wilderness without learning to read the physical geometry of a threat. Cameron reached the cabin, his boots crunching violently in the packed snow. He didn't look at her. He pushed past her, kicking the door open. "Get inside," he barked. Clarissa hauled the bucket over the threshold, setting it down with a slosh. Cameron was already at the window, scraping a circle of frost away with his thumb peering down the valley. "What is it?" Clarissa asked, wiping her freezing hands on her apron. "A bear." "Wah, worse." Cameron said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He stepped away from the window and walked to the corner, pulling a heavy canvas bag from beneath the floorboards. He dumped it onto the table, Handfuls of brass cartridges clattered against the wood. He began loading the Winchester, shoving the shells into the loading gate with sharp, angry clicks. "There are tracks," Cameron said, not looking at her. "Down by the lower ridge, about 3 miles out. Horses, deep post-holing in the snow. Means they're heavy. Means they're being ridden." Clarissa's heart seized. It felt like a physical blow, a cold fist wrapping around her chest and squeezing the air from her lungs. "How many?" "2. Maybe they're just drifters." She whispered the words, sounding flimsy even to her own ears. "Hunters." Cameron finally looked at her. His eyes were hard flat and completely devoid of comfort. "Hunters don't ride 2 abreast up a dead-end draw in the middle of a winter storm. They're looking for a trail. They're sweeping the high cabins." He grabbed his Colt revolver, checking the cylinder before shoving it into his holster. Clarissa backed up until her shoulders hit the rough logs of the wall. The warmth of the cabin vanished. The smell of the roasting meat on the fire turned sickening. Boyd Campbell's men. They hadn't given up. They had waited for the weather to break, and now they were coming to collect the debt. She looked at Cameron. He was strapping a bandolier across his chest. He was preparing for a war he had absolutely no stake in. "You can't shoot them," Clarissa said, her voice shaking. Cameron paused a cartridge halfway to his pocket. He looked at her like she had lost her mind. "If they come up that pass, they aren't coming to trade recipes. They work for Campbell. If you kill them, he won't stop. He owns the sheriff in Red Creek. He owns the judges. They'll declare you a murderer. They'll put a bounty on your head, and they'll hunt you until they hang you." Clarissa pushed off the wall, limping towards the table. "You have a life here. You survived. You can't throw it away for me." "I'm not throwing anything away," Cameron snarled, grabbing his coat. "I'm protecting my property." "I am not your property," Clarissa shouted, the raw desperation tearing at her throat. "I am a liability. I brought this to your door. I broke your lock, I ate your food, and now I'm bringing dead men to your porch." She turned and marched toward the door, ignoring the sharp, shooting pain in her heel. She reached for the heavy wool coat hanging on the peg. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Cameron demanded. "I'm leaving," Clarissa said, pulling the coat over her shoulders. Her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't manage the buttons. "If I walk down the western slope, I can draw them off. They'll see my tracks. They'll follow me away from the cabin." "You won't make it 2 miles. That's 2 miles further from you." She finally managed the first button. She turned to look at him, her face pale, her grey eyes shining with unshed tears. "You saved my life, Cameron. You gave me 4 days of warmth when I deserved to freeze. I'm not letting you hang for my husband's debts." She reached for the iron latch of the door. Cameron's hand slammed against the wood inches from her face, holding the door shut. Clarissa flinched, bracing herself, closing her eyes. The silence stretched. It was heavy, thick with the smell of wood smoke and gun oil. When Cameron spoke, his voice wasn't a bark. It was quiet. It was the sound of a man who had spent 5 years running from the world, suddenly deciding to plant his feet. "You walk out that door and they catch you," Cameron said, his breath hot against the cold timber. "What happens then, Clarissa?" Clarissa kept her eyes closed. "They take me back to Campbell. I work in the saloon." "No," Cameron said softly. "You don't. A woman who breaks her own foot dragging herself up a mountain to escape a man doesn't go back and pour his whiskey. You'll fight them, and they'll kill you in the snow." Clarissa swallowed a sob. She opened her eyes. Cameron was looking down at her. His jaw set the scar on his chin, pale against his skin. "Take the coat off," he said. "Cameron, take the damn coat off, Clarissa." He pulled his hand away from the door, stepping back. He didn't yell. He didn't posture. He simply delivered the truth with a brutal, uncompromising certainty. I didn't pat your foot and feed you my winter stores just to watch you commit suicide in my front yard. You're staying. They will kill you. They can try. Cameron walked back to the table and picked up the Winchester. The metallic shuck-clack of him racking around into the chamber echoed in the small room. They're 3 miles out. The sun is dropping. They'll have to make camp in the draw or they'll freeze. That gives us 12 hours. He turned to her, his eyes locking onto hers. There was no annoyance left in his gaze, only the cold, hyper-focused clarity of violence. Are you going to stand there crying about it, or are you going to help me board up the windows? Clarissa stared at him. The fear was still there, a cold, heavy lump in her stomach, but it was suddenly eclipsed by something else. A fierce, burning spark of awe. He wasn't kicking her out. He wasn't hiding her. He was standing beside her. She took a slow, deep breath, forcing the tremor out of her hands. She reached up and unbuttoned the coat, letting it fall to the floor. "Where are the nails?" she asked. The hammer strokes were deafening in the small cabin. Cameron drove thick, rusted nails through the rough-sawn pine boards, securing them over the 2 small windows. He worked with a grim, practiced efficiency. Clarissa held the wood steady, her hands vibrating with every blow of the hammer. By dusk, the cabin was a wooden box. The only light came from the hearth, and even that was a risk. "Kill the fire," Cameron ordered, setting the hammer on the butcher block. Clarissa hesitated, the iron poker in her hand. "It's going to drop below 0 tonight. If they crest the ridge in the dark, smoke will lead them right to the door. We wait them out in the cold. Shovel ash over the coals. Keep a baseline of heat, but no light, no smoke." She did as she was told. The heavy scrape of the shovel echoed as she buried the glowing embers. Instantly the shadows leapt up the walls, swallowing the room. The oppressive weight of the mountain night pressed against the chinking. Cameron dragged his heavy wooden table across the floor, wedging it under the iron latch of the door. He arranged his ammunition on a stool beside his chair. A box of .44 caliber rounds for the Winchester. 6 loose shells for the Colt. A rusted double-barreled shotgun he pulled from beneath the floorboards, loaded with buckshot. Clarissa wrapped herself in the heavy wool blanket sitting on the floor, with her back against the stone fireplace. It was the warmest spot left in the room. Her breath plumed in the dim, residual glow of the smothered fire. Cameron took a seat in his wooden chair, facing the door, the rifle resting across his thighs. The silence returned, but it wasn't the tentative, careful silence of the past 4 days. It was a coiled spring. An hour passed. Then 2. The cold crept through the floorboards, sinking into their boots, biting at their fingers. "You didn't answer me earlier," Clarissa said softly, her voice barely carrying over the faint whistle of the wind outside. Cameron didn't look away from the reinforced door. "Didn't hear a question. I asked why you're throwing your life away for me." "I'm not. You are Cameron." Clarissa pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "You live up here for a reason. You're hiding. You don't want trouble. I am nothing but trouble." Cameron's thumb brushed over the hammer of the Winchester. He listened to the wind. "I'm not hiding," Cameron said, his voice flat. "I'm just done." "Done with what?" "People." He shifted in his chair, the wood groaning. 5 years ago I ran a freight wagon out of a silver camp in Nevada. Had a partner. Good man. Had a wife, 3 kids down in Carson City. The mine boss was a piece of work named Silas. No named Hatcher. Cut our pay. Skimmed the weight. My partner threatened to go to the marshals. Hatcher had him beaten to death in an alley. Claimed it was a robbery. Clarissa stopped shivering. She watched the dark silhouette of the man in the chair. "What did you do?" "I waited until Hatcher went to the saloon. I walked in, put a bullet in his knee so he couldn't run, and another in his chest so he couldn't talk." Cameron stated the facts with a chilling lack of emotion. It wasn't a boast. It was a ledger entry. Then I rode north, kept riding until the air got too thin for men like him to breathe. He turned his head, his eyes catching a faint glint of moonlight bleeding through a crack in the boarded window. I didn't come up here because I was scared of the law, Clarissa. I came up here because if I stayed down there, I would have killed every man who looked like Hatcher. I would have never stopped shooting. Clarissa absorbed the confession. She didn't shrink away. She understood the pure, distilling clarity of hatred. She had felt it every time Boyd Campbell looked at her. Campbell is a man like Hatcher. Clarissa whispered. The world is full of men like Hatcher. Cameron replied. Men who think a piece of paper or a thick wallet gives them the right to own the people around them. They push and they take and they expect the world to just roll over and expose its neck. He looked back at the door. I came up here to stop shooting. Cameron said, his grip tightening on the walnut stock of the rifle. But I'll be damned if I let one of those bastards kick my door in and take what isn't theirs. Clarissa reached into the pocket of her oversized coat. She pulled out the heavy iron skinning knife Cameron had let her use the day before. She placed it on the floor beside her thigh. If they get past you, she said, her voice dropping the last remnants of its tremble, they aren't taking me back alive. Cameron looked at the knife, then at her. In the gloom, her face was a pale mask of absolute resolve. They won't get past me, Cameron said. They didn't speak again. The temperature continued to plummet. Frost began to form on the inside of the door hinges. They sat in the freezing dark, two ghosts waiting for the violent living world to finally catch up to them. The morning did not break. It bled. A dull grey light filtered through the cracks in the boarded windows, illuminating the plumes of white breath in the freezing cabin. Cameron hadn't slept. He sat motionless, a stone gargoyle in the pale morning. Clarissa dozed fitfully, her body shivering violently in her sleep. Then Cameron heard it. It was faint at first, easily mistaken for the crack of a freezing pine branch. But Cameron knew the rhythm. Crunch, drag, crunch. The heavy, laborious sound of horses fighting through chest-deep powder. He stood up. The chair didn't make a sound. Clarissa's eyes snapped open. She didn't ask if they were here. She read the tension in Cameron's shoulders. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the sharp spike of pain in her heel, and moved to the far corner of the cabin, behind the heavy oak butcher block. She gripped the skinning knife so hard her knuckles turned bone white. Cameron walked to the window on the right side of the door. He peered through a narrow gap between the pine boards. Two riders emerged from the timberline. They were bundled in heavy canvas and furs, their faces obscured by scarves and low-pulled hats. Their horses were blowing hard flanks, heaving coats caked in frozen sweat and ice. The lead rider carried a lever-action rifle across his saddle horn. The second man had a shotgun resting against his thigh. They stopped 30 yards from the cabin. The lead rider pulled his scarf down. He had a thick, matted beard and a face heavily scarred by smallpox. He spat a stream of dark tobacco juice into the pristine white snow. "Cabin!" The man bellowed, his voice echoing off the jagged peaks. "We see the smoke vents. We know you're in there." Cameron didn't move. He kept his eye on the gap, his finger resting outside the trigger guard of the Winchester. "We ain't looking for a war," the second man yelled. He was younger, wiry, with a nervous energy that made him constantly shift in the saddle. "We're looking for a woman, Clarissa Higgins. She stole property from Mr. Boyd Campbell down in Red Creek. We track her prints right up to your ridge." Silence stretched across the snowfield. The wind howled a low, mournful sound. "Listen to me, mountain man!" The bearded man shouted, losing his patience. He raised his rifle an inch. "You hand her out and we ride away. Mr. Campbell is a generous man. He'll pay you for your trouble. You keep hiding a thief, and you become an accomplice. The law says we can take you both." Cameron stepped away from the window. He looked at Clarissa. She was pressed against the wall, her breathing shallow. Her eyes fixed on him. She wasn't pleading. She was just waiting for his verdict. Cameron walked to the door. He didn't move the table. He stood close to the thick oak planks and pitched his voice to Kerry. "The woman isn't here." Outside, the horses shifted nervously. "You're a liar," the bearded man called back. "There's only one set of tracks coming up this pass. They end at your woodpile. I found her dead in the lower draw 2 days ago." Cameron lied, his voice steady and cold. "Frostbite and exposure. Buried her under the rocks by the creek. You're wasting your time. Turn around." The two men exchanged a look. The younger one seemed to hesitate, looking at the brutal, freezing expanse of the mountain. But the bearded man scowled. He spurred his horse forward, closing the distance to 20 yards. "I don't take the word of a squatter," the bearded man spat. "I'm coming in to see for myself. You open this door, or I'm taking it off the hinges." Cameron's eyes narrowed. He stepped back from the door, moving to the narrow gap in the window boards. He raised the Winchester, settling the heavy steel barrel into the crack, resting the brass bead of the front sight squarely on the bearded man's chest. "You take one more step toward my porch," Cameron said, his voice dropping the pretense of negotiation, "and I'll empty your saddle." The threat hung in the freezing air. The bearded man's face flushed dark purple beneath the cold. He was used to terrifying dirt farmers and indebted miners. He wasn't used to staring down the black bore of a rifle held by a man who had nothing to lose. "You're making a mistake, boy," the man snarled. He didn't spur his horse forward. Instead, in a blur of motion, he jerked his rifle up to his shoulder and fired. The gunshot shattered the morning. The heavy bullet tore through the pine board inches from Cameron's face, showering him in sharp wooden splinters. The sound was deafening inside the closed cabin, a concussive shockwave that rattled the pans on the hearth. Clarissa screamed, dropping to her knees behind the butcher block covering her ears. Cameron didn't flinch. He didn't shout a warning. He didn't fire blind. He adjusted his aim a fraction of an inch to the left, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. The Winchester roared. The bearded man's horse reared back, screaming as the bullet tore through the rider's left shoulder. The man dropped his rifle, falling backward out of the saddle with a heavy muffled thud into the snowdrift. The younger man panicked. He spurred his horse hard, raising his shotgun. He fired both barrels at the cabin. Buckshot peppered the heavy oak door and the log walls like a handful of gravel thrown against a tin roof. It didn't penetrate the thick timber. Cameron racked the lever of the Winchester, the spent brass casing flying over his shoulder to ring against the stone hearth. He tracked the moving rider, leading him by a foot, and fired again. The bullet took the younger man's horse in the neck. The animal collapsed instantly, a dead weight pitching forward into the snow, throwing the rider violently over its head. Cameron stopped firing. He racked a fresh round into the chamber and waited. Outside, the air was suddenly still again, save for the frantic thrashing of the bearded man in the snow, clutching his shattered shoulder, cursing into the powder. The younger man was groaning, trying to drag himself out from under the dead weight of his horse. "Reload," Cameron said, his voice entirely calm, not taking his eyes off the gap. Clarissa scrambled forward on her hands and knees. She grabbed the spent brass casing off the floor, her hands shaking so badly she dropped it twice. She reached into the canvas bag on the stool, pulled a fresh .44 caliber shell, and handed it up to Cameron. He took it without looking, sliding it into the loading gate of the rifle. "They're down," Cameron said, "but they aren't dead." He watched through the splintered wood as the bearded man managed to pull himself to his knees, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side, blood painting the pristine snow a bright, shocking crimson. The man was looking around frantically for his dropped rifle. "Are they leaving?" Clarissa asked, her voice tight, hovering near his waist. "Not yet." Cameron tightened his grip on the stock. "They're realizing they brought a rope to a gunfight. Gun smoke hung heavy in the cabin, stinging Clarissa's eyes. The sharp, acrid smell of burnt sulphur masked the lingering scent of wood ash and cold earth. Outside, the groans of the wounded men carried through the freezing air. Cameron pulled the heavy table away from the door with a scrape that rattled the floorboards. He unlatched the heavy oak slab, cracking it open just enough to let the brutal wind slice into the room. He didn't step out. He stayed in the threshold, the Winchester raised, the barrel resting against the doorframe. "Drop the shotgun!" Cameron called out. The younger man was kneeling in the snow, frantically trying to untangle his leg from the stirrup of his dead horse. He froze. His shotgun was lying 10 feet away, half buried in a drift. "Kick it further away," Cameron ordered. The kid scrambled backward, kicking snow over the weapon, his hands raised in the air. He was shaking his breath, coming in short, terrified gasps. "Mister, please." The kid stammered, his voice cracking. "My leg's pinned. It's broke, I think." The bearded man was sitting in the snow, clutching his shoulder. Blood poured between his fingers, staining the white powder a deep, ugly red. He glared at Cameron, his face pale and slick with sweat, but the bluster was gone. The shock of the impact was setting in, stripping away his arrogance. Cameron stepped out onto the porch. The wind ripped at his canvas coat. He kept the rifle leveled. Behind him, a shadow moved. Clarissa stepped into the doorway. She was holding the rusted, double-barreled shotgun Cameron had left by his chair. The weapon was heavy, awkwardly large in her hands, but she held it steady, the twin black bores pointed squarely at the younger man in the snow. Her face was a mask of cold, unyielding iron. Cameron glanced at her, surprised, but he didn't tell her to go back inside. He nodded once. He walked down the wooden steps, his boots sinking into the knee-deep snow. He approached the bearded man, kicking the dropped lever-action rifle far out of reach. He stood over the man, casting a long, dark shadow across the snow. "You're bleeding out," Cameron said flatly. "You hit an artery, you'll be dead in 10 minutes. If the cold doesn't stop the flow, you won't make it to the tree line." The bearded man grimaced his teeth, chattering uncontrollably. "Help me up. I shoot men who shoot at my house." Cameron replied, his voice devoid of anger. It was a simple statement of fact. "I don't patch them up. Campbell." The man wheezed, his eyes rolling back slightly. "Campbell will send 20 men." Cameron crouched down, bringing his face level with the wounded man. The cold was absolute, biting into their exposed skin. "Listen to me closely, because I am only going to say this once," Cameron said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "You ride back to Red Creek. You tell Boyd Campbell that Clarissa Higgins died in the snow 2 days ago. Tell him you found the grave. Tell him a crazy squatter shot you for trespassing." The man blinked, trying to focus through the pain and the shock. He won't believe it." "He will if you tell him," Cameron said. He reached out, grabbing the man by the collar of his heavy fur coat, hauling him violently to his feet. The man screamed a high, ragged sound as his shattered shoulder ground together. Cameron shoved him toward the surviving horse. "If Campbell sends men up here looking for her, I'll kill them." Cameron continued, walking right behind him. "And then I'll ride down to Red Creek, I'll walk into his saloon, and I'll put a bullet through his left eye. You tell him that. You tell him the man on the mountain said the debt is paid." The bearded man stumbled, falling against the flank of the nervous horse. He grabbed the saddle horn with his good hand, hauling himself up with an agonizing groan. He slumped in the saddle, barely conscious. Cameron turned his attention to the younger man. The kid was still trapped under his dead mount. Cameron walked over, grabbed the horse's bridle, and put his back into it, heaving the massive carcass just enough for the kid to pull his leg free. "Get up," Cameron ordered. The kid scrambled up, favoring a badly bruised knee. He looked at Cameron, then at the bearded man, bleeding over the saddle, then up at the cabin porch, where Clarissa stood, the shotgun, unflinching. "You're walking," Cameron told the kid. "Lead the horse. Keep him upright. If he falls off, leave him. Don't stop until you hit the lower valley." "My gun," the kid whispered, looking at the snowdrift where his shotgun lay. Cameron raised the Winchester, aiming it at the kid's chest. "Start walking." The kid didn't argue. He grabbed the horse's reins and began to drag the animal through the deep snow, heading back down the pass toward the timberline. The bearded man swayed in the saddle, a trail of dark red droplets falling into the pristine snow behind them. Cameron watched them until they disappeared into the trees. He didn't lower his rifle until the wind had completely erased the sound of their departure. Only then did he turn back to the cabin. Clarissa was still standing on the porch. The shotgun was heavy, her arms shaking from the exertion of holding it up, but she hadn't lowered it. The wind whipped her hair across her face. Cameron walked up the steps. He reached out and gently pushed the barrel of the shotgun towards the floorboards. "They're gone," he said. Clarissa let out a long, ragged breath. The adrenaline left her all at once. Her knees buckled. Cameron caught her before she hit the wood. He dropped his rifle, putting an arm around her waist, supporting her weight. She was freezing her clothes too thin for the biting wind, her body trembling violently against his side. "Come on," Cameron said softly. "Let's get the fire going." He helped her inside, kicking the door shut behind them, sealing out the brutal white world. The winter did not break easily. It held the mountain in a vicious, icy grip for another 2 months, a relentless siege of snow and wind. But inside the cabin, the siege had lifted. The oppressive silence that had marked Clarissa's first days was gone. It was replaced by the steady, comfortable rhythm of shared survival. The heavy table no longer blocked the door at night. The windows were unboarded, letting in the pale blue light of the high country mornings. Clarissa's foot healed completely, leaving a thick, jagged scar across her heel, but the limp faded until it was barely a memory. She took over the maintenance of the cabin with a quiet, fierce dedication. She didn't just cook. She stretched the sparse rations, finding ways to make the hardtack edible by soaking it in rendered fat and wild onions. She mended the traps, stitched the canvas, and kept the hearth fire burning. Cameron watched her change. The hollow, desperate woman who had broken his lock was gone. The frontier had tried to kill her, and Boyd Campbell had tried to break her, but she had refused to shatter. Instead, she had hardened into something resilient and sharp. He found himself looking for her when he walked back from the trap lines. He found himself gathering extra pine boughs just so the cabin would smell better. He didn't speak of it. Words were cheap on the mountain, easily blown away by the wind. He spoke in actions. He carved her a proper chair out of a fallen oak, sanding the wood smooth so it wouldn't catch on her skirts. He traded 3 prime beaver pelts to a passing Shoshone hunting party for a heavy wool blanket that he placed on her side of the room. They never talked about Boyd Campbell. They didn't need to. The message had been delivered. No riders ever crested the ridge. The debt was buried in the snow. In late April, the thaw finally arrived. The ice on the creek cracked like rifle shots, giving way to rushing dark water. The snowpack began to retreat, revealing patches of brown earth and the pale green shoots of spring grass. The air lost its vicious bite, turning crisp and smelling of wet pine. Cameron stood on the porch, a string of freshly caught trout hanging from his left hand. The sun was setting, casting long golden shadows across the valley. The peaks glowed with a warm amber light. He opened the door and stepped inside. The cabin was warm, but it wasn't the stifling, desperate heat of a survival fire. It was the deep, comforting warmth of a home. The heavy cast-iron pot hung over the flames, bubbling slowly. Clarissa was at the workbench, repairing a tear in one of his canvas sacks. She looked up as he walked in. Her face was fuller now, the color returned to her cheeks. She smiled, a small, genuine expression that reached her gray eyes. "You caught something." she noted, setting the needle down. "Creek's running fast," Cameron said, walking over to the butcher block and setting the trout down. "Fish are hungry." He turned around and leaned against the block, watching her. She walked over to the hearth, picking up the wooden spoon to stir the pot. The scent of roasted fish, wild carrots, and thyme filled the room. "You used the thyme again." Cameron observed a faint, dry amusement in his voice. Clarissa didn't flinch. She tapped the spoon against the rim of the pot and looked back at him, her chin raised in that familiar, stubborn tilt. "I found a patch growing near the South Rocks yesterday," she said. "I figured I should replace what I stole." "You didn't steal it," Cameron said quietly. "You earned it." Clarissa looked at him, the spoon hovering over the pot. The space between them felt suddenly charged, not with tension, but with a deep, unspoken understanding. They had fought the winter together. They had fought the men who came to take her. They had drawn a line in the snow and held it. She turned back to the fire, ladling a heavy portion of the thick broth into a tin bowl. She walked over to the table and set it down in his usual spot. She didn't retreat to the corner. She pulled out the oak chair he had carved for her and sat down across from him. "Eat," Clarissa said, her voice soft but firm. "It's better when it's hot." Cameron walked to the table. He looked at the bowl, then at the woman sitting across from him. For 5 years he had tried to carve a life out of isolation, convinced that caring for another human being was a fatal weakness. He picked up his spoon. The stew was perfect. Rich, heavy, and full of life. He didn't want to be alone anymore. He didn't have to be. He took a bite, looking across the scarred wooden table at Clarissa. She was watching him, a quiet contentment settling over her features as the firelight danced in her eyes. They had nowhere left to go. And for the first time in a very long time, Cameron realized they were exactly where they were supposed to be. If this gritty, unyielding tale of survival defiance and finding a home at the edge of the world struck a chord with you, don't let the fire die out here. Hit that like button to keep the hearth warm, share this story with someone who appreciates a true Western showdown, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more deeply human, high-stakes audio dramas. Drop a comment below. Would you have held the door like Cameron or braved the storm like Clarissa? Your support keeps these stories alive. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your aim true.